Once upon a time, in the vast kingdom of Ator, there was a great king named Abadina. King Abadina was loved by his people, for he was just, kind, and brave. The people of Ator thought the gods had blessed him with everything. But there was one thing that made the king's heart heavy. His son, Prince Omotayo, was born different. Omotayo could not walk like other children. His legs were weak, and he had to be carried everywhere. His stepbrother, Adigun, was strong and tall, and many thought he should be the true heir to the throne. But King Abadina believed Omotayo was special and loved him dearly. The palace was always filled with whispers. Some said Omotayo was cursed. Others said he was a sign from the gods. His mother, Queen Folishade, didn't listen to them. Every day, she told Omotayo stories about brave kings and warriors. One day, she said, "You will be strong, my son. Never lose hope." Omotayo's life changed when he was 10. One rainy night, the palace was filled with cries. The great King Abadina had fallen ill and passed away. The kingdom mourned, but trouble began to brew. Adigun, his stepbrother, wasted no time. He declared himself king and told the court that Omotayo was unfit to rule. "We cannot have a crippled king," Adigun thundered, and the crowd, frightened by his power, agreed. Queen Folishade knew their lives were in danger. Late one night, she carried Omotayo on her back, and together, they fled the palace. They traveled for days, through forests and rivers, until they reached a neighboring kingdom called Apenrin. The king there, a kind man named Adwol, gave them shelter. In Apenrin, Omotayo's life began to change. Though he still could not walk, he watched the warriors train every day. He learned their movements, their strength, and their focus. Queen Folishade told him, "If you cannot walk, use your arms. If you cannot fight, use your mind. You are more than your legs, my son." Omotayo began training in secret. At first, it was difficult. He would fall and get hurt, but he never gave up. Slowly, he built his strength. By the time he was a young man, Omotayo was not the same boy who had fled the palace. But back in Ator, Adigun was growing more ruthless. His greed had no end. He taxed the people heavily, and anyone who dared to oppose him was thrown into the dungeons. The people of Ator cried out for help, but no one dared to challenge Adigun. As Omotayo trained in Apenrin, he began to hear stories of his homeland. The tales of suffering reached his ears, and his heart burned with a fire he had never felt before. "I must go back," he told his mother one night. "You are not ready, my son," Queen Folishade replied, her eyes full of worry. "But if I don't go now, my people will suffer even more," Omotayo said. Queen Folishade looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. She sighed deeply and said, "If you must go, then go with the wisdom of the gods. Remember all that you have learned." Omotayo nodded. He didn't know how he would face Adigun, but he knew one thing. He could no longer run. Omotayo prepared himself for the journey back to Ator. He fashioned a staff from the strongest wood in Apenrin, a symbol of his determination. Though his legs were still weak, his arms had grown powerful, and his mind was sharper than a blade. Before he left, King Adwol called him to the royal chambers. "Prince Omotayo," the wise king said, "you are brave to return, but bravery alone does not win battles. Take this." King Adwol handed him a small pouch. Inside was a golden amulet. "This was blessed by our seer. It will guide you in times of great danger. Trust it." Omotayo thanked King Adwol, and Queen Folishade embraced him tightly. "Remember," she whispered, "you are destined for greatness. Do not doubt yourself." With that, Omotayo began his journey. The path to Ator was treacherous. He moved through thick forests, crossed raging rivers, and climbed steep hills. Each step reminded him of the stories his mother had told him about warriors who never gave up. When he finally reached the borders of Ator, he saw how much the kingdom had changed. The once lively streets were now empty, the fields barren, and the people looked weary and afraid. Whispers of Adigun's cruelty filled the air. Omotayo knew he couldn't reveal himself yet. He disguised himself as a wandering storyteller and began visiting the villages. At night, he would gather the people and tell them tales of hope and bravery. He reminded them of the greatness that once was Ator. Slowly, he gained their trust. One evening, in the shadow of the mountains, an old man approached him after one of his stories. "You speak of hope," the man said, "but hope cannot defeat Adagun's army." Omotayo smiled. "Hope is the seed, Baba, but the people of Ator are the roots. Together, we can grow strong again." The old man studied him closely, his eyes narrowing. "You speak like the king we lost long ago," he murmured. "Who are you, boy?" Omotayo hesitated, but then he said, "I am Omotayo, son of King Abadina, and I have returned to take back what is ours." The old man's eyes widened. He knelt before Omotayo and said, "If this is true, then the gods have answered our prayers. You must lead us." Word of Omotayo's return spread like wildfire. Villagers began to gather, men and women who had once been warriors, farmers, and traders. They had been broken by Adagun's reign, but Omotayo's courage reignited their spirits. In secret, they trained under the moonlight. Omotayo led them, showing them the techniques he had learned in Apenrin. Though he could not run or march like the others, his strategies were clever, and his leadership inspired everyone. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, Adigun grew restless. Rumors of a rebellion reached his ears. "Who dares to challenge me?" he roared. His spies brought him a troubling report. "The people speak of Omotayo, the crippled prince." Adigun laughed bitterly. "A cripple? Leading a rebellion? Let him come. I will crush him myself." But Adigun underestimated Omotayo. The prince's army grew stronger each day. His people were no longer afraid. They believed in him, and with each passing moment, Omotayo's resolve deepened. One fateful night, under the cover of darkness, Omotayo led his people to the gates of the palace. They moved like shadows, swift and silent. The guards, unprepared for an attack, were overwhelmed. As Omotayo stepped into the courtyard, the moonlight revealed a figure waiting for him. It was Adigun, clad in armor, his sword glinting in the pale light. "You should have stayed in hiding, brother," Adigun sneered. "Now, you will die where you stand." Omotayo gripped his staff tightly. "This kingdom belongs to the people, Adigun, not to your greed." The battle that followed was fierce. Adigun's soldiers were well trained, but they fought without heart. Omotayo's people, however, fought for their homes, their families, and their future. As the chaos raged around them, Omotayo faced Adigun. The two brothers stared each other down, their fates entwined in this moment. The clash between Omotayo and Adigun shook the courtyard like a thunderstorm. Adigun swung his heavy sword with ferocity, his strikes aiming to end the fight quickly. But Omotayo was swift and calculated. Using his staff, he deflected each blow, his movements honed by years of relentless training. "You think you can defeat me?" Adigun snarled, slashing again. "You are nothing but a crippled boy, unfit to be king." Omotayo didn't respond. He moved with grace, using his staff to keep Adigun at bay. His stepbrother's strength was formidable, but Omotayo's patience was his greatest weapon. He waited, reading Adigun's movements, looking for an opening. Around them, the battle roared. Omotayo's followers, though outnumbered, fought with fierce determination. The palace guards, loyal to Adigun only out of fear, began to falter. Some even dropped their weapons, unwilling to fight against their own people. Suddenly, Adigun lunged forward, his blade aimed straight for Omotayo's heart. But Omotayo was ready. He sidestepped the attack and brought his staff down hard on Adigun's wrist. The sword clattered to the ground, and Adigun stumbled back, clutching his arm in pain. Omotayo pointed his staff at his stepbrother. "This is your last chance, Adigun. Surrender, and I will spare you." But Adigun's pride burned brighter than his reason. With a roar, he charged again, bare-handed, aiming to overpower Omotayo through sheer force. Omotayo spun his staff, using it to sweep Adigun's legs out from under him. The tyrant fell to the ground with a thud. Omotayo pressed the tip of his staff to Adigun's chest, pinning him there. "Enough!" Omotayo's voice echoed across the courtyard, silencing the battle around them. "This fight is over." The remaining palace guards dropped their weapons, realizing the inevitable. The people of Ator gathered around, their faces filled with hope and awe. They had seen their miracle prince stand tall, not with his legs, but with his courage and wisdom. Adigun glared up at Omotayo, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won?" he spat. "The throne will destroy you, just as it destroyed our father." Omotayo looked down at him, his expression calm. "The throne didn't destroy our father. It was greed and hatred. I will not let it destroy me or our people." With a wave of his hand, Omotayo called for the elders of the kingdom. "Take him to the dungeons," he said. "He will face justice, not revenge." As Adigun was dragged away, the crowd erupted into cheers. Omotayo stood in the center of the courtyard, the moonlight casting a glow around him. The people chanted his name, their voices filled with gratitude and pride. But Omotayo raised his hand, calling for silence. "This victory is not mine alone," he said. "It belongs to all of us. Together, we will rebuild Ator, stronger and fairer than ever before." The people cheered again, their spirits lifted. For the first time in years, hope returned to the kingdom. Omotayo knew the journey was far from over. The kingdom needed healing, and there were still many challenges ahead. But as he looked at his people, he felt a strength he had never known before. He turned to his mother, who stood watching with tears in her eyes. Queen Folishade embraced him tightly. "You have proven them all wrong, my son," she whispered. "You are truly a miracle." Omotayo smiled, but his heart was already preparing for the next chapter of his journey. He knew that ruling a kingdom was not about power but about serving the people. And so, the miracle prince began his reign, determined to bring peace and prosperity to Ator. But fate had other plans, and new challenges loomed on the horizon. The days that followed were filled with celebrations. The people of Ator rejoiced, rebuilding their homes and hearts with hope under their new king. Omotayo, though now seated on the throne, refused to forget the hardships he and his people had endured. Each morning, he held court in the great hall, listening to the concerns of his people. Farmers spoke of poor harvests, traders shared tales of broken roads, and the elders whispered of distant kingdoms eyeing Ator's newfound peace. One day, as Omotayo sat with his advisors, a messenger arrived in the palace. He was a young man, his clothes tattered and his face pale with fear. He bowed deeply before the king. "Your Majesty," the messenger stammered, "I bring news from the southern borders. A warlord from the kingdom of Arawa marches toward Ator with a mighty army. He has sworn to conquer our lands and claims that our kingdom is weak." The room fell silent. The advisors looked at one another, their faces grim. Ator had barely begun to recover from Adigun's rule. The thought of another war was almost unbearable. Omotayo, however, remained calm. He rose from his throne, his staff in hand. "Tell me," he said to the messenger, "how many men does this warlord command?" "Thousands, Your Majesty," the messenger replied. "They march with iron weapons and horses. Their leader, Abalola, is known for his cruelty and strength." Omotayo nodded, his mind racing. He dismissed the messenger with thanks and turned to his council. "We cannot let fear rule us," he said. "We must prepare. Summon the warriors and the blacksmiths. Fortify our borders and ensure the people are safe." The advisors hesitated. One of the elders, an old man named Adebisi, spoke up. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice cautious, "we are still weak. Perhaps we should send word to the neighboring kingdoms for help." Omotayo shook his head. "Help may not come in time, Baba Adebisi. Ator must stand on its own feet. We have faced adversity before, and we will face it again." As the preparations began, Omotayo spent his nights in the palace courtyard, training with his warriors. Though he was king, he did not want to sit idly while his people fought. He taught them the strategies he had learned in Apenrin and reminded them of the strength that lay in unity. The people rallied behind him. Even those who could not fight contributed by forging weapons, sewing armor, and tending to the wounded. Omotayo's leadership inspired them all. But as the days passed, the tension grew. Scouts brought news that Abalola's army was drawing closer. The warlord's men burned villages in their path, leaving destruction wherever they went. On the eve of the battle, Omotayo stood atop the palace walls, gazing out at the horizon. The stars above were bright, but his heart was heavy. He thought of his father, King Abadina, and the weight of the throne he now bore. Queen Folashade joined him, her presence a comfort. "You are troubled, my son," she said softly. "I wonder if I am ready for this," Omotayo admitted. "My people believe in me, but what if I fail them?" Queen Folashade placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have already faced what most men would not survive. Remember, a true king is not measured by the battles he fights, but by the love he holds for his people. That love will guide you." Her words gave Omotayo strength. He nodded, his resolve firm. The next morning, the fields outside the kingdom were filled with the sounds of war. Abalola's army arrived, their banners casting long shadows over the land. The warlord himself, a towering figure clad in dark armor, rode at the front. His eyes were cold, his presence menacing. Omotayo stood at the head of his army, his staff in one hand, and the golden amulet from King Adwol in the other. His people were behind him, their faces filled with determination. As the sun rose, the two armies faced each other, the tension thick in the air. Abalola rode forward, his voice booming across the battlefield. "Who dares to challenge me?" he demanded. "Bring forth this so-called king, and I will show him the meaning of fear." Omotayo stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I am Omotayo, king of Ator," he declared, "and you will find no fear here." The warlord laughed, but there was unease in his eyes. Omotayo's presence was commanding, his voice unshaken. The battle began, and chaos erupted. Omotayo fought alongside his warriors, his staff a blur as he defended his people. Though his legs were weak, he moved with purpose, his mind always a step ahead. The golden amulet seemed to glow as he fought, and those who followed him felt its power. It was as if the gods themselves were guiding Omotayo, protecting him and his people. But Abalola was a force to be reckoned with. His strength was immense, and his soldiers were ruthless. The battle raged on, each side pushing the other to the brink. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Omotayo found himself face to face with the warlord. The two leaders stood amidst the chaos, their armies watching in awe. Abalola grinned, his sword glinting in the fading light. "You are brave, little king," he said, "but bravery will not save you." Omotayo tightened his grip on his staff, his heart steady. "This land is not yours to take," he replied, "and I will not let you destroy my people." The two charged at each other, their clash shaking the very ground beneath them. Omotayo and Abalola clashed like two storms meeting in the sky. The warlord's massive sword swung down with terrifying force, each blow meant to crush. But Omotayo, despite his weak legs, moved with unmatched agility, his staff spinning and blocking each strike with precision.